Greetings and welcome. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. Generally here on the channel we paint landscapes, but we're going to do this set of 3 roses today. While I may love landscapes and landscape painting, sometimes I do like to try something a little bit different and paint a flower or 2. Today we paint 3. That was a joke. It was not a good joke, but it was a joke. With that said, the subject matter here today, these flowers, is fairly different than what we normally do. So if you'd like help with the drawing process, you can find the digital sketch up over on Patreon. You can also find the full 2-hour-long version of this, which is uncut, so you get to see all of it up on Patreon. You can also find the other 40 lessons. It's also a great way to support the channel and help keep the lights on, which is also a joke because I only paint in natural light. All of that said, if you need any help, I am here to help. Leave a comment in the comment section down below, and let's jump into today's hour-long cut-up lesson thing. Now, jumping into this, I'm going to be using a smaller square-headed brush, as you can see here. I'm going to dip the tip of it in water, not the entirety of it, because we don't want to hurt the binding and the glue up here. Then I'm going to wipe my brush off so that it is simply wet, or rather damp, not wet. And then I'm going to go to my palette. Now here I have a titanium white, a Mars black, and a primary red. And we're going to start on this flower here. Now the light is hitting this way, so we're going to start with some brighter areas. I'm going to grab some of our primary red, and we're going to keep the colors fairly simple in this, just so that we can really play with the light and build things up. So I'm going to take some of that pure primary red with this small square-headed brush. I'm going to start painting around the edges where the light is really going to be coming from. Now we're using the square-headed brush because it has very sharp edges, which is great for working around these outlines, but it's also fantastic because it can hold a good amount of paint. You can see I've gotten all of this done without reloading my brush once. We can also be a little bit messy here because I've drawn the image on with a black sharpie and it shows through generally the first layer of paint. Then I'm going to get a little bit of Mars black. We're going to mix it on our palette because it's generally easier to mix on the palette because we don't have to worry about changing our painting dramatically if we don't get exactly what we want. So then I'm going to take some of our primary red down in here, mix a much darker version of that pigment. And I'm going to apply that down here in this crease and blend upwards. Then I'm going to blend softly into the rest of the flower. You see that? And we're already establishing some depth. It's a lot darker down here because the light coming this way can't get down there. It's being blocked by this petal and all of the shadows that it creates. Now we're going to grab some highlights. So I'm going to take some of this titanium white, move it over here, going to grab some of our primary red, mix it in, and now we have a very light pigment. It's pink. And I'm going to apply this to the petal in the areas that I think it's going to receive the most light. So an area like here, and then the top of this lip. And I'm going to blend it out. You can blend it wet into wet, or wet into dry, and that just means you can blend this new wet paint into previously applied wet paint, or if the paint underneath is dried, you can blend it into that. You'll just need a little bit more water. So it depends on how quickly you like to work. Here I'm going back in and I'm adding in a little bit more of a highlight, blending it out as we did before, keeping it brightest in the areas that are going to be receiving the most light. We're going to take a little bit of that darker pigment, and as you can see it's fairly dry on my palette, so I'm going to mix up a little bit more. Mars black, primary red. Not going to make it dark, we're just going to make it slightly darker than what we already have. We're going to blend upwards. There we are. Connecting it a little bit with the white, but now we're getting something much more three-dimensional. And it takes layering like this. It takes time to really get it right, but flowers are a fantastic place to try all of this. So that's a good start. We'll probably go back in and touch it up, as we'll go back in and touch up all of these. But we're going to do that once we have the entirety of the rose done, so we have an idea of what we want to touch up and ensure that it's cohesive. So next I'm going to work on this leaf, or petal, I keep doing that, again right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this time with the darker pigment. So we're going to go closer to the flower, the middle of the flower, because it's going to be more cast in shadow. We won't see as much highlights there. This is going to be casting a shadow. So we're going to get some of our red, we're going to mix it with our Mars black. I'm going to go around the edge of this. Do another application there. As you can see, it's much more vibrant than this area because we didn't add the white, which didn't mix with the black, which didn't make it gray. So depending upon the look and aesthetic you're going for, you can do either. You can do a mix of both. I'm probably going to do a little bit of a mix of both, but I think that's also just so we can go over the learning process of it all. So here I'm grabbing some titanium white, some of our red, mixing up a pink just like we did, and I'm going to go around the edges that are going to be receiving the most light. Now I'm going to take a break from working on those for just a little bit, and we're going to work on the middle of our flower here. I'm actually going to stick here with the smaller square-headed brush because it does have those sharp edges, and I can use the corner for the extremely detailed areas. So we're going to begin, as we did in the past, darker pigment in the darker areas. We'll start here. Here I am just using the corner of the brush instead, because it's allowing me to get a much more fine application. There we are. It'll be nice and dark in here. It'll be dark on the edge here. It'll be dark inside here. All of the areas that the light can't hit. You should be kind of guessing along here with the areas that we're going to make darker. That way when you go to do your flowers and other paintings of flowers, you also know where to add the highlights and where not to. Grab some primary red. Move it out, blend it. Still have some on my brush here. It's fairly thin because of all the water, but that's okay. We intended to do multiple layers anyway. Covering most of it with this red. Then we can go back and add in the highlights and more darker areas as well. We're going to grab some titanium white, some primary red, some nice highlight pigment. Using the corner of our brush, add in that highlight. There we are. Take more titanium white. And then I actually began working on this other petal because I thought, hey, that could use some more highlight. That's okay, you can jump around if you need to. Now admittedly, it's still a little bit messy, but I do want to let that dry before I go back in. Because at some points, if you just keep working wet paint over wet paint, it can become a little bit muddy. And that's really not what we're trying to achieve here. So I'm going to begin working on the other petals while we let that dry. Starting with some of our brighter primary red. This time I think we'll start with the mid-tone just to show you that there are more than one way to do just about anything in painting. Now we'll mix a little bit of our darker pigment, like that. We're going to start in at the edge and the crease because it's going to be far less light in there. And then it'll get darker as it moves upwards and outwards. We'll get lighter rather. Now I'm going to grab some primary red and reincorporate that into different areas as well. Blending it softly over our highlights to create more of a gradient. Then we'll get some really thick pigment, which means we'll get a lot of pigment on our brush here, because we want to apply a heavy application. Because we're working on very delicate areas, and it's nice if we only have to do it once or twice. So, here I'm going back in, throwing the highlights on these very delicate, smaller areas. Now we're going to jump back into the painting with our medium-sized square-headed brush. Going to ensure that it is damp. Then we have primary blue and primary yellow. We're going to use these to mix a green. So we're going to take a very small amount of primary blue, a good amount of primary yellow. You'll need much more yellow than blue because it's a much weaker pigment. And we can apply that initially. Now here, as you'll probably notice, it's far too bright, far too saturated. That's because we don't have any black or white in there. There isn't any gray in this. Now we can go through and create our first layer with these pigments just to get some paint on there. But then we'll need to come back in here and really add in some detail, some proper values. And then we'll switch over to our smaller square-headed brush as it can handle the detail. So we'll pick that up. We'll grab some of our Mars black, mix that into our green, grab a little bit of titanium white, turn it into a nice gray. And we're trying to desaturate this for a couple of reasons. The first and most important being, though, that we want it to match in hue, in color, with our flowers, which aren't hyper-saturated. Letting the leaves be a little bit more impressionistic, a lot more of a brush stroke in them. And I'm doing that because I want the attention to be on the roses themselves. So as we get farther and farther into the background and farther and farther away from the things that are at our main point of attention, we're going to get a lot more loose with the brush strokes, we're going to get a little bit more desaturated, and we're going to tone down the values a little bit. So right now I'm quite happy with those. If we need more detail in them, we can add it back later. But now I'm going to clean my water, clean my brush, and we're going to start on the background. So I'm going to begin here by taking a bit of a gray. I'm going to take some black, I'm going to throw that on the canvas. I'm going to take some white, I'm going to throw that on the canvas. Just going to throw that around a little bit. We're going to find the color that we want on the canvas. We're going to do that in a very interesting way. So we'll also take some blue and we'll throw that in there. We've been mixing everything on our palette so far, and generally I advise that, but you can also mix on the canvas. And I thought I'd show you how we could go about doing something like that. Notice nothing here is as dark as the darker portions in the roses. It's fairly dark in comparison to everything else, and it looks dark, but it's not as dark. Throwing in blues, throwing in yellows. Just cleaning that up. There we are. So I'm liking the greens. It's looking very fresh. The green and the red are complementary colors. I do want to try more of a blue heavy mixture though. So over here, I'm going to take a blue, we'll take some titanium white, because we can't have it be a pure blue, it'd be far too saturated. We need to tone it down and significantly. I'm also using the edges of my brush to cut in around the rose. Generally, working on the background second is ill-advised, but I felt like the rose was sharp enough edgewise that we could go about doing so. Now, again, I like this area. I feel like it needs a little bit more diversity, but I want to work into it naturally from the other side. So I'm going to continue up and around here. And up and around here I can use much more greens because we're not touching any leaves. So we'll take some yellow to begin with and just kind of patch that on in there. Then we'll take a little bit of blue, Maybe make a bit of a nice vibrant green, a little bit darker up here. Take a little bit of Mars black. And then we'll add in our white, which will desaturate everything immensely. There we are. Grab a good amount of it. Now it's very, very bright right now, which you might like. You might want this to be a brighter painting, but if you don't, you can always add in some additional Mars black and tone it all down. Now the top here, it's all fairly dry. And something you can do if you feel that it's too bright at the end but you don't want to redo all of the colors, is take a little bit of black, move it down here, grab a lot of water on your brush, and make almost a watercolor black, just like that. See, it's almost liquid, not paint. Then you pick an area and you just apply a wash. You do this a couple times in an area and it will begin to get darker. Just another little technique you can incorporate. Hey there, it's Ryan O'Rourke. I truly hope you enjoyed today's little extra video. It was essentially a cut-up version of one of the many hour-long lessons which we offer over on patreon.com. Over there you'll also find digital sketches of the 10-minute painting lessons, digital sketches of these hour-long painting lessons, and a bunch of reference photos as well. So if any of that interests you, or if you just want to support the channel, go over there and check it out. It is a pleasure to make these long form videos and I love to share them with all of you. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Saturday with a new video, and above all, as always, stay creative.